In this second part of ancient Egypt, we're going to focus now on the New Kingdom. We finished up the Old Kingdom with Menkaura and his wife and all the pyramids, and we're now going to transition into the New Kingdom. Sometimes the New Kingdom is referred to as the Egyptian Empire. It's a period of ancient Egyptian history between the 16th century BCE and 11th century BCE, and it pretty much covers the 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties of Egypt. Before we progress, a couple of things I want to make note of. First, please remember that your graphic notes require a simple sketch, very, very simple sketch of each image. And something's going to be a little bit different for these images. You are not going to see them categorized on my Google slide. They are not pre-categorized for you in regards to content, context, form, etc. You will need to kind of sort that information on your own. Now, it doesn't have to be perfect, and sometimes information can actually be a part of two or more categories at the same time. But for the most part, I want you to try to decipher which information belongs into which category. By doing that, you are actually having to pause and process the information. It's very easy to just copy information down from the slide to your graphic notes and not even be aware of what you're writing down. And so making sure that, we are um, putting information into our brain for storage, for some long-term purposes, by having to process the information and categorize it, you will actually learn better. So be aware of that. And also, because the information is down on the slides, and plus I have posted some incredibly helpful videos about each image. I am really just going to give you an overview in this screencast. I won't be going into every piece of detail, and I will just kind of be making sure I hit the main points, the points that I think are very heavily weighted to AP. Okay, so moving forward. Our first image for the New Kingdom is image number 20. It is called the Temple of Amun-Re and Hypostyle Hall. It is located in Karnak, Egypt. It's part of the New Kingdom from the 18th and 19th dynasties. So we're around 1550 to 1250 BCE. We're looking at a complex that's made of sandstone and mud brick. I've put up here some images of the Temple of Amun-Re to really help you understand how humongous this complex is. We have multiple things happening in this place. We have large exterior kind of fortress walls with only certain gate entrances, and inside of the gates we have both an apostyle hall and we also have a temple. A lot of times for these complexes or for these architectures, you're going to see some floor plans. When AP provides you with a floor plan, it's important to make note of some of the basic elements to the floor plan. You don't need to study every nook and cranny, but this kind of aerial perspective gives you a better understanding of these very humongous, large, complex places that will only increase once we get over to Greece and Roman architecture. There will be multiple buildings within one arena, and it's a lot easier to understand these complexes from floor plans. For this floor plan, you'll want to make note that we have um, these large pylons with entrance gates here, and pylons are basically big kind of gated walls, and we're going to have open court areas. So here we have the great court, here we have a central court. When we also look at a lot of Asian art, you're going to see complexes like this as well. um, this is showing you the apostille hall. So being able to recognize this grid, this dotted grid pattern represents the columns, with the roof that goes over the columns. It's important to understand that we also have a temple located in this area, and just kind of what the basic floor plan is, where you enter, how you proceed through the complex, and into the temple. So going over some basic information, I think it's important for you to understand the location of the Temple of Amun-Re. I gave you kind of almost like a satellite image here of where it's located in regards to the Nile, and that's going to be some important contextual information here in a second. Um, but showing you the amount of space that this complex used to take up. Now remember, we are left with ruins, and so a lot of our images just kind of show you what's left. But it's important to understand the size, the impact, and the greatness of it when it was, finished being constructed. What we have here is just an apostille hall that has absolutely humongous columns that are extremely packed very tightly together. And because of that, if you think of all these columns with a flat roof, there's not a lot of natural light that gets into this area. Now, they have definitely figured out a way to kind of resolve that problem, and that's definitely an innovation that we will see here with this apostille hall, is that we have what is called a clerestory. And I'm going to go back to the previous slide. So what you will see here in your notes is we have these columns in the center of Hypostyle Hall, okay, that are much taller than the surrounding ones. Here's another cross section of it, okay. So these center columns are extremely tall. What that has done is the roof is taller in that area. So where the roof is taller, they have put in these kind of windows or these openings, and that's called the clerestory. We will see a lot of this being repeated later on in Greece, Rome, but also in um, ancient Christian construction of churches. And this is one of the kind of earliest um, uh, evidences of invention of this clerestory. So very important feature here. We have columns that were elaborately painted with massive lintels. We have capitals on these columns that are highly carved, that represent both lotus flowers and the papyrus plant, which are two symbols extremely important to Egyptian culture. Um, we enter the entire complex through a massive pylon, which we talked about right here as this big, massive gates, these pylons. And within from there, we go into a peristyle courtyard. A peristyle courtyard, let me go back, is this right here. So basically, it's a row of columns with an overhang. So I want you to think A great example, if you are familiar with Cedarhurst and the White Mitchell Museum, where everybody goes to take homecoming and prom pictures, okay? That white building has a peristyle. And what that is if you think of a front porch that's lined with columns, that's a peristyle. So as we go through the pylons, we have a peristyle around the courtyard that takes you into the Hypostyle Hall. Um, Through Hypostyle Hall, then we have a massive temple complex that was the principal religious center that paid homage to the god Amun-Re. Okay, so this is where the temple got its name from the god that it is its main worship. Okay, it's definitely one of the largest religious complexes in the world, and it's important to note that even though this is the temple of Amun-Re, that there were also some subsidiary temples there as well, and also paid homage to the gods Mut and Montu. Like I said, the site was first developed in the Middle Kingdom, towards the end of the Middle Kingdom. It took a long time, 2 dynasties to complete, but most of it was added onto and completed during the New Kingdom. Okay. Karnak was known in ancient times as the most select of places, and not only again was this a location of the cult image of Amun, but also a place for the god to dwell on earth. So that's an important thing to understand about these temples. We've already talked about that with Mesopotamia and the Ziggurat temple, that the gods needed some sort of transitionary place to descend from the heavens. Continuing on, that we have the main architectural structure is based off of 2 axes. So you have one that went north and south, and then the other that extended east and west. We're going to talk a lot more about architectural floor plans and axes as we get into kind of the early Byzantine Empire, and talk about a lot of the churches that are erected during the antique period. So we're gonna learn a lot more about that. But what is most important for you to understand from the Temple of Amun-Re is who was worshipped in this temple, that it had both this humongous, massive, gigantic hypostyle hall, that it integrated one of the first clerestories um, to allow light to come into the hypostyle hall, and that it was also had a main temple, but some subsidiary temples as well, um, and that the entire complex was highly and extremely decorated. And we're actually going to talk a little bit more about this on the next slide here. I think what is super fascinating to remember contextually, because this is about understanding the symbolism of Egyptian culture and where the origin of some of their symbols come from. And a lot of the temples were representative of the idea of the first time. So Zep Tepi, or the first time, which basically was their belief system in the beginnings of the creation of the world. Okay, and their beginnings of the creation of the world was when the mound of creation emerged from the primeval waters. Okay, so The pylons, this is where the symbolism comes in. The pylons, or those big, huge gateways, represent the horizon. And as you would move through, remember how very long and kind of rectangular this complex was. As you would enter the gates and move further into the temple, the floor would actually rise. It was kind of up on a slant until you would reach, it would continue to rise just like a subtle incline until you would reach the sanctuary of the god, Amen. And it would give that impression of the mound. It would be symbolic of the mound of creation. Then you have the temple roof. And remember that hypostyle hall is all these columns and a flat roof. Well, the temple roof would represent the sky, and it was often, because everything was painted, okay, very colorful and very painted, the top of the ceiling would be decorated with stars and birds and the sky, and it would just kind of be representative of the heavens, and then the columns would be represented kind of as like the nature around you, the flora around you. That's why you had a lot of carvings of the lotus, the papyrus. You would see palm plants, not only just carved but also painted. This was to reflect the environment, okay? And then the outer area, so beyond the walls of the Temple of Amun-Re and the outer areas of Karnak, remember I told you earlier it was important to understand um, how close the complex was to the Nile River. Well, that's because it was specifically designed to interact with the river. So we know that seasonally the river would flood, okay? It was something that allowed civilization to flourish there. The fact that it would flood, it would keep that surrounding area very lush and full of life. And knowing that the Nile would flood, and when it would flood during the same time of an annual inundation. And so during that time, waters would rise, and even the Temple of Amun-Re would flood. But that was on purpose. That was symbolic. It was symbolic of those waters of creation coming towards um, flooding, and then the mound being created from those waters. So this is a beautiful example of symbolism, innovation of construction, and blending with contextual religious belief. All of these harmonize together to create a really, really beautiful structure. Okay, moving on to our next image, number 21. This is the statue, okay? It's called the Kneeling Statue of Hatshepsut. It's from the New Kingdom, 18th dynasty. Now we're up to 1473 BCE, and we are looking at red granite. Granite is a very dense material. And even though this is about the statue, okay, the AP wants you to be aware of the statue. I've included all these other images because in order to understand the contextual information to this statue, you're going to need to understand all of the complex that this statue came from, and of course some contextual and historical information of Hatshepsut herself. This video you must watch. Again, all of these videos I'm posting are between 5 and 7 minutes long, and it's super concise. It gives you such wonderful views of the artwork that still pictures just don't do it justice. You will walk away with very complete understanding of these artworks by giving 7 minutes of your attention. And again, since you are using these videos to help you understand, I'm just going to kind of hit the highlights. So, this is one of our foremost of noble ladies. She was the fifth pharaoh in the 18th dynasty of Egypt, and she was only the second historically confirmed female pharaoh. Um, Her rise to power is such an interesting story, but to long story short, she had such a very clean bloodline back then. Bloodlines were kept very pure to the point where, there was a lot of inbreeding. There was a lot of marrying cousins and procreating and, even sister brides and things like that. But, back then it was a clear understanding of that was how to keep the bloodlines pure because remember, these bloodlines are also divine. They are they are given to you by the gods, and so it's important to keep that very, very pure. Okay. Um, what the story is that Hatshepsut and Thutmose II, okay, they were married and had a daughter, and while Thutmose II also fathered a son, okay, so Hatshepsut did not have a son; she had a daughter, but her husband had a son with a lesser wife, okay, because there was polygamy. You had your main wife who, would have been, your first wife and your most important wife, but then you also had a few kind of lesser unimportant wives. And Thutmose had a son with this lesser wife, okay? His his name obviously was Thutmose the Third. Okay, he was also named his father's successor, which makes perfect sense. Okay, Thutmose the Second. Okay, so the father died while his son, the third, was still a very, very young child. So Hatshepsut, being the first and most important wife, she decided to kind of stand in place of, being pharaoh until Thutmose III was old enough to take over the state affairs. Okay, well, in the seventh year of her regency, she kind of just broke with that tradition and decided that, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and crown myself Pharaoh of Egypt. And that she did. So she has a really interesting story, and it's very interesting when you look at art history and with a feminist perspective. Hatshepsut was definitely one of those kind of early feminist artworks that doesn't get any notoriety for that, but historically speaking, she definitely does. So she was a wonderful pharaoh, and that's important to understand. She really helped Egypt flourish during her time of reign. She reestablished a lot of trade networks. She built a lot of things. She really kind of expanded Egypt. It was just super prosperous, and it was also very peaceful. Nobody was in conflict with anybody or at war with anybody else. Um, and like I said, she's just a really prolific builder, commissioned hundreds of construction projects, but also commissioned advancements in kind of like irrigations and just civilization, things that civilization needed to better their living conditions. Okay. Back to our image though. So the statue is just one of over 200 statues that were placed around a temple. So there were lots of these statues. And out of all of these statues of Hatshepsut, 10 of them were just like the one of our image where she's kind of holding these jars. And what these jars are their offering jars. And what she's doing is kneeling before the sun god, and basically, giving her alms or her offerings. Okay. The offering that she is giving to is the god Amun. And in the statue, she is wearing the crown that represents Upper Egypt. Um, Interestingly enough, though she crowned herself pharaoh, she definitely took on a lot of the like symbolism that a pharaoh would wear. So she would wear the false beard, she would wear the kilt, she would wear the crown, um, but yet whenever her physique was carved or sculpted, you could still tell that she was male. I mean, she kind of had a broad shoulders and looked very strong, but there was always still the the understanding that she was female, kind of, suggestions of breasts and slight femininity. So it was kind of like this balance that she was creating. She was definitely taking this, male role, but still allowing herself to also show her feminine side. So the building is important because this is where these statues were located. And what it is a temple, and it's an entire complex as well. Okay. We have actually multiple temples here. We have courtyards. And what is so amazing about this place is that it is literally built into a cliff wall, and the video highlights that really wonderfully. So the other lovely thing about the temple is that it is very, very geometric and organized with, patterns and, repetitions of columns. You have lots of peristyles and all this order, it just beautiful, wonderful, clean, exact, measured order, but it's completely juxtaposed and up against this natural landscape built inside and kind of jets out a little bit of the cliff wall. And that contrast between, the organic and the natural, and then this very organized structure is just absolutely lovely. So this mortuary temple was commissioned by Hatshepsut, and it was kind of mirrored off of Mentuhotep's the second temple. She really admired his temple and kind of based it off of his. She had commissioned her mortuary temple right after she kind of claimed herself to be pharaoh and came into power in about 1479, and designed the temple to basically tell the story of her life. Um, One thing that Hatshepsut is known for is really being able to kind of advertise herself and selling herself. She was able to elevate her public image, immortalize her name, and what's so amazing is she used art and architecture to really help get everybody on board. She was able to establish her authority and the legitimacy of her reign by all of this kind of design and construction that she led during her reign. It's important when you do your content to make sure you include a lot of the details that are here on this page, talking about the stairwells, talking about the arches in the alley and the ramps, that, there were couple of courtyards, a second level, that it's kind of important to be able to name a lot of the structural details. Um, Also, there's multiple little chapels and temples that are part of this mortuary temple. So it's important to be able to look at that, look at the floor plan for this, and be aware of the different temples and chapels that exist on this complex beyond just her mortuary temple. This is a floor plan that's going to give you those understandings where we have different tombs and courtyards and chapels, and again, this is all kind of the mythological story that she has put together within a structure to kind of tell the story of her life, but also kind of her divine life. As we move on to the next image, I really want to pause for a second because we talked in the past about the importance of understanding that within the ancient Egyptian civilization, we saw this continuity of art. And I'm going to kind of, um, go back on my word here a little bit because we're going to look at a piece that is actually very stylistically different. But what's so interesting is there are contextual reasons for that. And before we get into those details, I just want to pause and have you take a moment to compare and contrast. So the next art piece we're going to talk about is this large piece over here on the right. I want you to look at the carvings, look at the figures, and compare and contrast. Not only do I want you to compare and contrast to Egyptian stylized art, which we have up here from the drawing of the Narmer's palette, but also look back to Mesopotamia as well and remember what their figures look like in the Code of Hammurabi, the Standard of Ur, and take those types of stylized forms and now take a look at our new piece here and try to make some notes as to what is different. How are the figures changed? Um, how are the lines and the shapes different? Um, the hieroglyphics appear to be the same, but I really just want you to focus on those figures for a second. Before we get into some of the details about this piece, let's go over our identifying information, and then we're going to talk a little bit about this period of Egyptian history. So this image is image number 22. It's titled Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and Three Daughters. It's from the New Kingdom during the Amarna period in the 18th dynasty, about 1353 to 1335 BCE, and we're looking at carved limestone block. The Amarna period was a really significant era in Egyptian history. It didn't last very long. It was during the latter half of the 18th dynasty, still part of the New Kingdom. But what's interesting here is we had a real shift in not only leadership, but also just kind of a weird little blip in that Egyptian continuity that we talked about. So, in terms of history, the royal residence of the pharaoh and his queen was shifted, and that kinship, that bloodline was shifted to Akhenaten, which is now the Amarna period, okay? And it was marked by the coming of power in the reign of Amenhotep IV. Amenhotep IV then changed his name to Akhenaten. Okay? He changed his name in order to reflect this dramatic change that he instituted upon his reign. And what he did is he took Egypt's kind of polytheistic religion and he changed it into a slightly monotheistic religion where the sun disk god, whose name is Aten, was worshipped more than any other god. So within Egyptians' culture, you have a plethora of gods and goddesses. that are kind of equal in terms of importance. But when Akhenaten came into power, he changed that. He literally shifted kind of cultural perspective, cultural belief, cultural practice, and said, you know what? We are now going to pay the most homage, the most attention, and the highest worship to the sun disk Aten. Okay. Now, don't get me wrong, there were still other gods and goddesses, but they were definitely under his leadership to be looked at as a lesser degree. Okay. So now all of a sudden, this Egyptian pantheon that existed for all of these years of these, equality of gods and goddesses who just, kind of had different roles and purposes, was now poof, gone, changed. You were told, you were mandated pretty much to believe in something else and to have a different type of belief system that dictated a lot of practices and rituals and other cultural attributes. This was a very, very short-lived era, and eventually the worship of the original Egyptian pantheon was restored directly under Akhenaten's successor, who was Tutankhamun. So, knowing a little bit of that very interesting history and that little snippet of Egyptian time, we can now look at this piece differently. And when we talk about content, what we are seeing here is the pharaoh Akhenaten, and he's holding his eldest daughter. Um, you can see we have some hierarchy of scale here because here's Akhenaten, okay, and then here is his wife, Nefertiti, and we have the three children, which are the three daughters, okay. Um, what is interesting here too is we have this symbol in the center of the sun disk. So that represents the primary god of Aten. And you can see the rays descending down on this kind of new royal family. And at the end of each of these rays, I have a close up here. We have the carving of the Ankh. The Ankh is the symbol for eternal life in Egyptian culture. Okay. In the background, we see a lot of hieroglyphics that have inscriptions with names and titles of the people that are depicted. And we have the function of this was kind of like almost a utilitarian function. It was a carving that was uh, kind of uh, produced and displayed not just in elite households, but in common households. So it was kind of a way to show commitment and homage, and to help. If you also think about the purpose of kind of shifting everybody's thoughts and worship and culture by creating these tablets, these carvings that are displayed in common households, then you're really kind of helping to sway um, people into being loyal to a new way of practice and a new way of thinking. What is so interesting, though, about this piece is this shift of belief is represented stylistically. And I think that this is just a great example of showing how art really, really does reflect society, and it really, really does reflect history. And this is why we're able to understand what we know about ancient history, or even near history, is because we have these artifacts, we have these relics that really do interpret what was happening at the time. And so this is just a perfect example, um, like I said, this snippet of time within such a long Egyptian history that's known for their continuity. So once the state religion had shifted, um, this the style of art began to evolve. And what we started to see here in terms of form, we have really smooth, curvy lines instead of very kind of rigid, rectangular, and angular lines. If you think about the Egyptian figures prior to Akhenaten, they're very rigid. They're very triangular. You know, you have the broad shoulder, the narrow waist, the straight legs. Everybody's standing very, straight backed and erect and stoic. Here we have figures that are extremely curvaceous. You can see curves in the shoulders, curves in the hips, curves in the bellies. And this is not just, as like a feminist representation. Both male and female are depicted in the same curvaceous way. We see very elongated limbs, very thin arms, necks, and legs compared to their torso section, which is quite curvaceous. We have slack jaw. Slack jaw, what that means is where the lips are, it's like a relaxed mouth where the lips are just kind of slightly open. So it just kind of shows this relaxed state instead of a very kind of at attention state, which is how we see all of the figures prior. It gives a really soft feeling. Um, it kind of gives a very comfortable feeling. And we start to see a little bit more detailing happening in terms of like folds of the robes and, details in the headdresses and some of the jewelry and adornment that is being worn. Um, and again, these, very, very long necks and kind of elongated heads and chins that kind of point out with pointy noses. So stylistically, it's just so different from everything we've seen before. And I even included a sculpture of Akhenaten to show you that this new kind of style of creating figures was not just something that happened in the two-dimensional realm, but also three-dimensionally. Any sculptures depicted during Akhenaten's reign had that same kind of stylistic touch with narrow waists and curvy hips and a bit of a belly and a pooch, but yet the body proportionally is very kind of vertical and elongated. Like I said, that these were placed in domestic abodes, kind of like, your way to pay homage, like an altar would behave. Um, but the other thing that's really cute is that we're also looking at at a glimpse of a pharaoh, okay? Remember, Pharaoh being godly, being divine, being depicted in like this everyday kind of family, um, picture, this family scene where he's sitting, um, opposite side of his wife and enjoying his three daughters. It's a very naturalistic kind of genre scene where it's almost like you kind of got a little glimpse into a private life that Akhenaten's not really um, uh, perceived as this strong leader who is stoic and unemotional, but quite the opposite. You're almost seeing like this sensitive father who happens to be our leader, who is enjoying and cheerfully playing with his children. So it's so different in so many aspects, and it's going to be extremely important that you're able to hone in on all of these different types of differences um, between form, line, shape, contour, but also just the scene itself. Our next image is about Tutankhamun, and this video here is important for you to watch. I think it's about a 6 or 7 minute video. So you'll get a lot of your details from that video. But what you need to know most about this image, it's image number 23, okay? It is Tutankhamun's tomb, but specifically it is the innermost coffin is what is being highlighted specifically in our AP image, okay? Of course, it's from the New Kingdom, 18th dynasty, 1323 BCE. We are looking at pure gold, not an alloy or anything like that, but pure gold with inlay of enamel and semi-precious stones. It stands 6 feet, 7 inches. It was discovered in 1922, so honestly, not that long ago. And it's despite the fact that King Tut wasn't a very long reigning ruler at all. He died a very early death, and we'll get into some of that contextual information here in a second. But his tomb was discovered in 1922. There were so many objects buried with him in his tomb. He was a mummified body. There were over 143 objects on his head, neck, abdomen, and limbs alone. There's also a gold mask that was placed directly over his mummified head. And this innermost coffin holds a crook, which with and a flail, which are symbols of Osiris. So the gods were thought to have skin of gold. Okay, so when you kind of pictured the gods in a type of mortal form, they were thought to have skin of gold, bones of silver, and hair of lapis lazuli. So the king here, in his innermost coffin, is being portrayed as he would look as a divine form, as a god. So that's what is symbolic about, the gold and the semi-precious stones. So King Tutankhamun is the son of Akhenaten, okay? Um, because of those bloodlines, trying to be as pure as possible, we have, studies and evidence that King Tutankhamun was probably the son um, of a brother and sister kind of relationship. Um, it was the last of his royal family to rule during the end of the 18th dynasty during the New Kingdom, and we know that he died from malaria, but there were definitely other health conditions that were very prevalent throughout his whole entire life, and pretty sure that they existed because of genetic deformities and the consequences of inbreeding. When Akhenaten died, there were two pharaohs that ruled briefly, and then until kind of like Hatshepsut, when she kind of stood in, waiting for the son to become old enough to reign. Kind of the same thing that happened with Akhenaten, but then once Tutankhamun was considered old enough to reign, he took the throne at age 9 and ruled until his death at age 19. So he had 10 years of reign. And what he's known for, beside his elaborate tomb, was that he was the one that brought that polytheistic society back. He did away with his father's kind of dictator command to worship one god. Um, we do know that Tutankhamun married his half sister, but because of Tutankhamun's health conditions, we know that they did not produce an heir. So this is actually where the bloodline had ended. So understanding this piece, it's important to know that he was excavated in what is called the Valley of the Kings, which was a royal burial ground located on the west bank of Thebes. And Tutankhamun's sarcophagus was kind of like, the Russian dolls, where there was a coffin inside of a coffin, okay? So his sarcophagus, which is like the outermost shell, held three coffins um, to hold the body of the king. The two outer coffins, they were made out of wood, they were carved, and they were still covered in gold and precious stones and painted. They were very elaborately decorated. The third is that innermost coffin that is made out of two sheets of gold, and then inside that innermost coffin, you have the mummified body, and on top of the mummified body, you have here the death mask. Okay. Um, the innermost coffin, like I said, was kind of molded and hammered out of sheets of gold. It weighed about 22.5 pounds, and we know that the back of this death mask, there were inscriptions with spell 151b, which comes from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and this particular spell is meant to protect the various limbs as you move into the afterlife. Our last image for the New Kingdom, and this will also wrap up ancient Egypt, is image number 24. It's called The Last Judgment of Hunefer from his tomb. It's from the New Kingdom in the 19th dynasty, and we have a kind of a painting on a papyrus scroll. So I do have a video that really gives you great details on the on this particular image, but we need to back up a little bit and make sure you understand some contextual information about the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The actual translation is the Book of Going Forth by Day, and what it is it's a book that provides spells for going forth into the afterlife, okay? It's a manual, per se, of how to successfully cross over into the afterlife. Ending your mortal life and moving into the afterlife is not something that happens automatically. It's not something that happens overnight. It is an actual journey. And the thing is, you can be denied into the afterlife. So, having a manual or some sort of map that helps you understand and navigate this journey is really what this is all about. Okay. Um, it basically depicts an individual's ka and helps, like I said, be their roadmap through the afterlife. No two copies are the same. So when you have one of these roadmaps made, you kind of commission them. They are made specifically by request for each individual, but they were expensive. So they're, usually a little bit more for the elite, or at least the people that could afford to have one made for them. What you see over here are some other examples of some of these pages that are, written for an individual's journey into the afterlife. So there were lots of these that were made, and they were found within the tombs of the people that had them originated. And so there's a ton of them. The one specifically that AP is having us focus on is the journey for Hunefer. Okay. We know that one that kind of had um, these made up, that were able to afford it and had one of these made up, that they were made by scribes. So that was another duty that a scribe would have, to make these kind of custom maps. And basically having one of these was kind of equivalent to like having the answers to, the SAT exam. It was like your cheat sheet, so that you knew exactly how to manage your voyage, and what you needed to do in order to ensure crossing over into the afterlife. So this video is what I want you to watch. That was a lot of the kind of contextual information about these papyrus scrolls, but you do need to know specific details about the Last Judgment of Hunefer because it is a narrative, and you do need to be able to talk in terms of content. What are we looking at in this narrative? What is it trying to say? So it's going to be very important for you to get that information from this slide and to also get the information from the video. Um, I'm going to allow you to kind of move forward and to get that information now, and we will be able to discuss it at a later time. Please don't forget that it continues on one more slide, that the story, the actual narrative of the journey that Hunefer needs to make into his passage is all right here. It gives you a lot of content information so that you know who you're looking at, who the gods are that are represented, and what they're doing to Hunefer, and what they're saying that Hunefer has to be able to do. I hope you enjoyed this second part of ancient Egypt and the New Kingdom, and I hope that you learned a lot of really great, interesting stuff from it.